This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a programme brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust and sponsored by Heritage New Zealand. I'm Dougal Stevenson. In this programme, Bill Southworth tells us about an Otago surgeon who was much admired for his skills during wartime. Gregor Campbell reports on a Port Chalmers mayor who once stood trial on pornography charges. The Southern Heritage Trust then details what is planned for the next Heritage Festival, and finally we hear about the strange case of the whisky distillery that never was. A Cromwell-born war surgeon, whose exploits are surprisingly little known in the country of his birth, is the subject of a new book. He's Dr. Douglas Jolly, an important figure in the Spanish Civil War. His surgical techniques were widely admired and adopted by many surgeons in wars since. Bill Southworth has been looking at his remarkable career.
Mark Darby's book, Frontline Surgeon, New Zealand's Medical Pioneer Douglas Jolly, was launched recently in Cromwell. The wonder is that Dr. Jolly is practically unknown here because arguably his contribution to surgery is right up there with people like World War II plastic surgeon Sir Archibald Macindoe. Dr. Jolly's medical manual, Field Surgery in Total War, was based on his operating experience in the Spanish Civil War and became the popular go-to manual for surgeons in the frontline MASH units in World War II, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. At the age of 32, Dr. Jolly cut short his surgical training in London and hurried to the Spanish Civil War to help the newly democratic Spanish government, which was being besieged by fascist forces led by General Franco. Jolly immediately set up one of the first frontline hospitals and went on to operate on thousands of badly wounded soldiers. I asked author Mark Darby to background Jolly's history.
Well, he was very much a son of the South. He was a third-generation resident of Cromwell. His grandfather had set up a general store there, which opened in 1870, and that building still exists in Cromwell. He was born in 1904 and was raised as one of 7 children of the local storekeeper. His mother was Elizabeth Waddell before she was married, and she had been a teacher at the one teacher Cromwell Primary School, which Doug later attended, and then Otago Boys High as a boarder, and then the Otago Medical School. He boarded at Knox College.
I understand that he was very active in the student Christian movement and became a lifelong committed Christian socialist.
He was very influenced by the General Secretary of the Student Christian Movement, who was also the chaplain at Otago University, a Highland Scotsman named the Reverend Donald Grant, who came out from Britain to take that position. He was a very inspiring, charismatic man, I believe.
He went to England when he finished his studies at the Otago Medical School to qualify as a surgeon. I understand that he didn't sit his finals, that he gave that up and went to Spain to help the Republican cause there, in other words, the government that had been democratically elected. Can you give us a bit of background about the Spanish Civil War in 1936? What was all that about?
It's a big topic and hard to summarise. A few years before 1936, Spain had elected its first reasonably democratic government. Prior to that, it had been a sort of semi-feudal monarchy, really. Some of the generals, including Francisco Franco, attempted to launch a military coup against this government with the support of the aristocracy and the big industrialists in the country. That coup failed. They didn't get enough popular support, including from within the military, to overthrow the government, but they had another card up their sleeve, and they called on military aid from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. And both countries sent very large numbers of trained troops and the latest military hardware, planes, artillery and so forth, into Spain to reinforce Franco's side in the Civil War.
General Franco and his followers were fascists, correct?
Yeah, there was a range of political positions represented by Franco's supporters, but broadly speaking, they were anti-democratic and could generally be described as fascist. They certainly were at the time described that way.
apart from Hitler and Mussolini supplying air force and arms and so on to Franco and his rebels, the Soviet Union, I understand, supplied arms and assistance to the Republican government, whereas the democratic nations of the West didn't give them any assistance at all.
No, through the League of Nations, they tried to confine the conflict in Spain to within the boundaries of that country. So they forbade other countries from supplying them with arms or even allowing those arms to travel through their own country. So the idea was to isolate Spain from involvement from other countries. And this agreement was ignored by Germany and Italy. They were both signatories to it, but they failed to honour it completely.
There were thousands of volunteers who went there to fight for the democratic government, and they formed international brigades, and that people like Hemingway and George Orwell went there to assist the Republican government. Hemingway
didn't go as a combatant. He was there sort of as a journalist and an observer. He didn't do any fighting. But Orwell did certainly serve on the front lines, yeah.
I understand that Dr. Jolly actually met Hemingway there in Spain.
Towards the end of the war, he did. He wasn't impressed by him. He had read his books and liked them. But when he met the guy himself, he thought he was a bit of a blusterer, blowhard, and he wrote back that he wasn't so impressed with Hemingway. They were extremely harsh conditions. As soon as he arrived in Madrid in late 1936, he was placed in charge of a mobile field surgery unit, about 12 people, doctors, nurses, and so on. The orders were to serve on the front line wherever the fighting was fiercest. So they were placed in extremely dangerous and difficult conditions. And for 2 years, Jolly and his team moved around Spain as the front lines changed and the battles ebbed and flowed. And they were always at the scene of the most fiercest fighting. So they would set up these mobile field hospitals, often at great speed, that is, arrive in the morning and be ready to go by the night, using tents sometimes using natural features like caves. They would requisition old buildings, abandoned monasteries and so on, railway carriages, whatever they could find that would serve them for a temporary hospital and which could be protected from aerial bombing, because the fact that they were a hospital offered no protection from bombing from the air. We do know that Jolly himself performed at least 2,000 abdominal surgery operations in Spain. That is more than a surgeon would carry out in their whole professional lifetime.
Jolly made a point of operating on captured nationalists like Germans and Italians as well.
Yeah, up to a point. I mean, he was a Christian socialist. He was a deeply humanitarian guy. He was not by any means a militarist, despite serving for wars. His approach was that everybody deserved medical treatment if they needed it. And he insisted, often against the wishes of his superior officers, on treating the most urgent cases first. If those urgent cases happened to be soldiers from the other side who'd been captured as prisoners or something, he said, right, they go to the head of the queue. And this was very unpopular often. You could, they'd say, look, these guys have just been bombing us and now you're putting them on your table and they're victims who are having to wait. He'd say, too bad. These guys will die if they're not treated now. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm a doctor. My job is to save lives.
He did what was called a Maori dance to raise their spirits. I guess he must have shown them a haka.
Yeah, and the only one that I can imagine he would have learned was the Otago Boys High School haka. I think he did this more than once. There are several different accounts from his nurses and other staff of him performing this strange Maori dance. On the face of it, this seems like a bizarre thing for a surgeon to do. If it happened in peacetime and some surgeon dropped his scalpel and started performing a haka in the operating theatre, you'd say, he's crazy, get him out of there. But this is wartime. And if they were hearing, the sound of bombs getting closer, the glass cracking in the windows, suddenly he breaks into a haka. And what happens is that he's saying to his team, I'm not scared. Why should you be scared? Let's defy these bastards, he's saying. Now, that was the actual original function of the haka in former times. And he, I think, intuited that function, and he used it in Spain to give courage to those he worked with.
The Spanish government, I understand, was eventually overwhelmed by the fascists and their Italian and German allies, and Douglas left Spain in 1938 and went to England. But I believe after he left that Franco carried out very savage reprisals on people who had opposed him, and that the Democrats and the left-wingers and so on, many of them were murdered by fascists. Is that correct?
It's certainly correct, but I can't say I know a great deal about that side of the Civil War. My research was on Jolly, and he had left by then, as you say, but there is no doubt that Franco and his troops were absolutely determined to reshape Spain as a very conservative, very Catholic, monarchist country. And they took children of Republicans away from their parents, raised them in convents so that they would not be affected by their parents' beliefs. They refused to allow other languages than Spanish to be spoken, such as Catalan and Basque, even though people might not have spoken any other language. It was certainly a very grim time, the Franco dictatorship. I've had several accounts of this from people who lived through it.
I understand Dr. Jolly wrote an excellent battlefield handbook on surgery that became very famous in the Second World War.
That's true, and in subsequent wars. I spoke to a New Zealand surgeon who served in Vietnam, and he carried that handbook with him and said there was nothing better that he could use, even 25 years later. The thing is that the Spanish Civil War was the first in history that featured intensive aerial bombing. This had never happened before, and it caused types of injuries and required systems of treatment that were entirely new, and these systems were developed in Spain. Jolly was a key figure in developing them. He knew that his experience would be required in the world war that he knew was coming. And so in 1939, he rushed out this book at great speed, and it was snapped up and used by surgeons in Britain, in the US, right across Allied armies. And the reviews I've seen, the accounts I've seen of those who used it are all overwhelmingly positive.
The book on war surgery by Dr. Jolly may well have contributed to the much higher survival rates amongst soldiers operated on in frontline military hospitals in both the Second World War and the Korean War. The survival rates were much better than they had been in earlier conflicts.
That's absolutely true. In World War I, surgeons were even instructed not to bother with stomach wounds because they took 3 times as long to operate on as more conventional wounds, and the survival rate was only a third as high. So from a practical point of view, if the goal was to win the war, you didn't waste time on abdominal wounds. Jolly refused to accept that equation.
Did he assist people in the Second World War as well?
Absolutely. He served right through World War II with the POMs, actually, with the Royal Army Medical Corps, mostly in the Western Desert, fighting against Rommel's forces, but then later, once they pushed them out of the desert over the Mediterranean into Italy. And he served as head of surgery in several different hospitals during the war, was awarded a military OBE, and eventually was demobilised at the end of the war with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel.
Dr. Jolly never settled back in New Zealand. After the Second World War, he remained in the United Kingdom and took up a position with the Queen Mary Hospital in London.
Queen Mary's Hospital, just outside London. It was a hospital set up in World War I to treat amputees, those who'd lost their limbs. And it's still there. It's still functioning. And I spoke to former staff who knew Jolly. So, he ended up as medical director. What is interesting is that he never practiced surgery after World War II, despite the fact that he was one of the most experienced and one of the most highly regarded surgeons in the world.
It's kind of ironic that after all those achievements and being so famous amongst military surgeons, that he is almost unknown in New Zealand.
He died in 1983, to be exact. But and it's quite true that his career greatly sort of subsided in peacetime and subsequently became practically forgotten. He was immensely highly regarded by those who'd worked with him, those who knew him during World War II and the Spanish Civil War. And guys who went on after World War II to become pillars of the National Health Service, I'm talking, having hospitals named after them, given knighthoods, this kind of thing, they said repeatedly, Doug Jolly was better than me. He's the one we looked up to. But his career faded into invisibility.
You have been listening to Bill Southworth interviewing author Mark Darby, whose book Frontline Surgeon, New Zealand medical pioneer Douglas Jolly is now available in bookshops. What society agrees is acceptable these days has changed a great deal from what was allowable in the 19th century. A future Port Chalmers mayor found himself in legal hot water for a photograph which passes as art now, but which was classed as criminally indecent back then. This report from Gregor Campbell.
David de Mouse is best known for his many photographs of the Port Chalmers area which survive today. Many are quite magnificent photos of ships of the late 19th century. He is less well known for being the first person tried under a new law passed in 1890. His case was reported in the Otago Daily Times in March of 1893. Selling an indecent picture, a photographer convicted. At the City Police Court yesterday morning, before Mr. E.H. Carew, SM, David DeMouse was charged with having, on the 27th February last, at Port Chalmers, sold a certain picture which was of an indecent nature. Mr. Solomon, who appeared on behalf of the defendant, said in this case the information was laid under an act which had come into force on the 1st of January of this year. He had seen the picture, which was the subject of the information, and he was unable to contend that it did not come within the wording of the Act. The only thing he could do in the matter, therefore, was to plead guilty for the defendant. It seemed to him it would be quite useless to waste the time of the court in contesting the meaning of the words of the Act, for he thought the picture in question clearly came within the words, which were very wide, and he thought, therefore, that the proper course to adopt was to plead guilty. He might say that on the day mentioned in the information, a large number of pictures, the number was getting on towards 20, was sold by Mr. DeMouse to a man who came into his shop. Whether the man came into the shop accidentally or for a purpose, counsel knew not, and perhaps it did not affect the case. One of the pictures sold to the man was the picture on which the information was laid, and he was unable to think that he could successfully contend that it did not come within the words of the Act. His Worship, I must know something of the case, so as to know what penalty to inflict. There may be degrees of culpability in a thing of this sort. Chief Detective Henderson said that complaints had been made to the police about the defendant selling obscene and indecent photographs, and on that account they sent a person on the 27th of last month to purchase some pictures. One of these was very indecent and obscene, and there was no doubt at all that it came within the meaning of the Act. The photograph in question was produced. His Worship, were there any besides this one? Chief Constable Henderson said there was only the one, but there were some photographs of naked women produced. David DeMouse was fined £3 with 15 shillings costs. The magistrate remarked that if there had been any adequate defence to selling a gross and disgusting photograph like the one produced, and if there was a chance of the case being dismissed, there would certainly be a miscarriage of justice. In later years, DeMouse made many appearances in the same court, sitting at the bench as Mayor of Port Chalmers. The detectives, who had bought the photos in question, doubtless destroyed the evidence, lest it survive to corrupt those of weaker moral fibre than theirs. A copy of the photo, which I would describe as a reclining nude, can be seen at the Port Chalmers Maritime Museum. Peruse it at your own moral risk. And I am the moral fortress that is Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
The October Ōtepoti Dunedin Heritage Festival will include the reopening of the restored Maritime Museum and the 150th celebration of Port Otago. It runs from October the 5th to Labour Day and includes the second week of the school holidays. The programme is still being finalised, but it's likely to include the following. The first week is Dunedin-based, focusing on families, especially to engage schoolchildren. Activities include workshops, Minecraft, genealogy, problem-solving, storytelling, competitions, talks, tours and exhibitions. Museums and libraries organise excellent programmes designed for all ages and cultures. History and significance of both Mana Whenua and Pākehā are incorporated throughout. During the weekend of the 19th and 20th, there will be the 150th anniversary celebrations of the Port Otago Board, and Port Chalmers will be the focus for festival activities in partnership with Port Otago. Saturday the 19th is the official opening of the Maritime Museum. It took 2 years' restoration of the old post office stone building and museum collections by Port Otago, who's the new owner. The Sunday is the museum's first public open day, which is hosted by Port Otago. In addition, the festival offers a choice of heritage-related activities in Port Chalmers and Dunedin, which continue until Labour Day Monday the 28th, when Port Otago will again host an open day for the Maritime Museum. The final festival programme and more details will be in next month's edition of Heritage Matters. In the 1900s, illegal stills were attracting the attention of the authorities. However, one in particular turned out to be more than they'd bargained for. This report from Gregor Campbell.
In June of 1908, the Evening Star reported, "The seizure of an illicit still at Walker Street discloses a daring attempt to evade the law. It is a wonder how the construction of the still could have advanced without the neighbours knowing of its existence. The Collector of Customs, with Constable Crookshanks, who made a most successful raid some time back upon a still at Silverstream, and another found the still head and worm in a washhouse adjoining the house where Donnelly, who is a seaman but who has been on shore for some time, resides. From the appearance of the still, Constable Crookshanks thinks it has just been tested and found complete. A fire was smouldering under the boiler and the apparatus was neatly constructed. The fence surrounding the washhouse was only 5 foot high, and a person attracted by the peculiar odour which the mash emits could easily have seen the still." Walker Street, now named Carroll Street, was for many years known as the Devil's Half Acre due to its cheap rent, a population outside of polite society, and the availability of pretty much anything money could buy, legal or not. William Donnelly's defence, that he had been engaged for a couple of hours furniture moving, and that he had no idea that the apparatus he was found tending was a still, was treated with understandable disbelief by the court. But the court were in for a surprise, as reported by the Otago Daily Times. It now turns out, however, that his tale is not far wrong, if indeed it is not absolutely correct, and that he was simply the dupe of 2 scheming knaves, who are now in the hands of the police. The story is an almost incredible one, but as supplied to us by reliable authorities, it is as follows. Some time ago, a man named Waters was sent down from Wellington to Dunedin, his duty being to ferret out any unlicensed stills that might be in existence in Dunedin or suburbs. He found that private stills were either not numerous or too difficult to discover, and accordingly he took steps to bring himself more remuneration, as well as the thanks of his employers for his services, and the way he set about his object was by attempting to play on an innocent individual, one of the most cowardly and selfish tricks that has ever been brought to light. He took into confidence a man named Stewart, who fixed up the still in Walker Street and did everything in connection with it, receiving his orders from Waters on all points, as the latter did not, of course, from his position, want to be seen in the locality of the still. When matters had reached a suitable stage, Stewart employed a man, the hapless Donnelly, to work for him in keeping up a fire under the still, the nature of which article Donnelly was not acquainted with. He was also to remove some furniture, and after having a glass of beer in the house with his employer, he went about his duties, while the latter left, as he said, on business. The business, it now turns out, was to communicate with Waters, who then set the police on the track of a man in Walker Street with an illicit still. The police speedily put in an appearance and found Donnelly keeping up the fire. The stillhead and worm were also in the place in which he was discovered, and with this strong evidence to back them up, the police soon had Donnelly in safe custody. Now, however, a very different face has been put on matters. Waters' conduct gave rise to suspicion and he was watched, with the result that he was posted as wanted. He was arrested in Dunedin last night by Constable Crookshanks, having just arrived from Invercargill. His associate, Stewart, was arrested at Gore yesterday morning by Detective Madden and will be brought on to Dunedin tonight. Stewart and Waters pleaded not guilty, but to no avail. Waters was sentenced to 2 years in prison and Stewart 6 months. And this is the not very illicit Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
The award-winning Heritage Matters is broadcast on the first Monday of each month at 9:30 a.m. and replayed on the following Sunday at 7 p.m. There are further replays on the third week of the month, Thursday at 1 p.m. and Sunday at 7 p.m. Or you can listen as a podcast from the Otago Access Radio website at oar.org.nz.
As Aotearoa New Zealand's national heritage agency, Heritage New Zealand Pohere Taonga is proud to sponsor Heritage Matters. Celebrate our heritage by becoming a member to visit more than 20 heritage places we care for across the motu for free. You'll receive a subscription to our award-winning magazine, exclusive member events, and free or discounted admission to over 1,000 international heritage places. Support the heritage of Aotearoa New Zealand. Check out visitheritage.co.nz.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.